Hi, and welcome to Sociology. We're looking at part 2 of social classification in Canada. Okay, now we're going to jump right into this as we have a fair bit to cover. Okay, contemporary sociological models of social class and structure in Canada. We're going to look at the consequences of poverty in Canada, and we'll touch on the theoretical perspective of poverty. Now, this is a bit of an under-discussed area in Canada, as we like to think everyone does well. We're generally just very happy and all middle class. However, statistically, there is a distinction of class structure in Canada. Okay, so we're going to look at two models. One based on Weberian approach, the other on Marxian approach. The Weberian approach is one class position is based on three elements. That your own class position is based on these three elements. One is education, the second is occupation of the family head, and three is the family income. Using the elements mentioned, the class structure in Canada is divided into 6 classes. Now, this is not the same as quintiles. Quintiles are 5 based on economy. These are not just based on economy. Remember, education, occupation, and family income. So these 6 classes is there: the upper class, upper middle class, the middle class, or lower middle class, and then there's the working class, the working poor, and the underclass. So let's look at how the Weberian describes each of these structures of social class. And we'll just do it briefly. The upper class, it's the wealthiest and most powerful class. They own substantial income producing assets. About 1% of Canadians, it's a very small number of these individuals, about, in the neighborhood of 1,000, or the upper class yield an enormous amount of power because of the amount of wealth they have. The second group, the upper middle class, they're highly educated professionals or derive their income from family-owned businesses. So they are professionals, they're educated, but their money that they have is not generally been earned on their own. They've inherited money. It's a combination of a university education, authority, and independence on the job, and high income qualifies people for this class. Now, this is a class that is most influenced by education. And then there's the middle class, or the lower middle class. It's traditionally the most middle class positions have been relatively secure and enabled some degree of advancement. But today, 4 factors have diminished the chances for material success for members of this class. 1, escalating housing costs. And you've certainly seen that during the pandemic. Occupational insecurity. Job security isn't there. Blocked upward mobility. You can't get ahead and go higher. 4, the cost of living squeeze. And it makes things very difficult for people. Then we can get into the 4th group, the working class. And it's about 30% of the Canadian population is in the working class. The core of this class is made up of semi-skilled machine operators as well as some workers in the service industry. Within this group are what is known as pink-collar occupations, relatively low-paying jobs, non-manual, semi-skilled jobs mostly held by women. Daycare jobs, checkout clerks, cashiers, waitresses, huge chunk of people. The working class families earn less than the middle class families and have less financial security. The working poor account for, well, we get into the working poor, the working poor is another category. The working poor account for 20% of the Canadian population. They live just above the poverty level. Important to note, we don't have a poverty line in Canada. So when we talk about living just above the poverty level, that's not meaning line. There are multiple ways to describe poverty, so that's why it's used poverty level in your textbook. Mostly in this group, it's unskilled workers, seasonal jobs, low-paying factory and service jobs. There are groups who are overrepresented in this class. Employed single mothers and children, members of visible minority groups, indigenous people, recent immigrants are overrepresented among the working poor. And then the last group is the underclass. They are very poor, seldom employed, caught in long-term deprivation that results from low levels of education and low income and high rates of unemployment, about 5% of the population. Some are unable to work because of racial or ethnic discrimination, age, or disability. Single mothers are overrepresented in this group. You may have noticed these categories are an equal you may have noticed that these categories are an equal distribution of the population, like quintiles that are 20% in 5 categories. But that is correct. Weber's work was to group people according to theoretical perspectives. That is, what is the state of society now? The quintile division is the statistical measure, and that creates equal-sized categories, 20% each, in order to demonstrate other data like income, expenditures, and things like that. Additionally, these categories were still based on prestige, wealth, and power. Next, we'll touch on the conflict model for social structure. The Marxian model, where Eric Olin Wright is on the leading theorist following the Marxian approach, Wright did not think that wealth, prestige, and power could capture the more modern world. Instead, according to Wright, there are 4 criteria for placement in a class structure. The first was ownership of the means of production. That's the capitalist class. They own the means to produce. Secondly was purchase of labor of others. Well, that was what he called the managerial class, that they purchase other people to do the labor, not the bosses, but the managers do. And then the third group was the control of labor of others. That's the small business class. And then the fourth group was the sale of one's own labor or the working class. So let's look at those individually. The capitalist class, according to Wright, the capitalist class holds the most wealth and power in society through their ownership of capital. Some of the sources of income would be profits, interest, and high salaries. Makes major decisions about the workplace. They're in a power position. They can make decisions, and everybody without opposition, or whether there is opposition, they can still make those decisions. That's power. Then there's the managerial class. In the managerial class, people in the managerial class do not own the capital, but have substantial control over the means of production. They have upper-level managers, or they are upper-level managers, supervisors, and professionals, and they may influence the organization of work and the treatment of workers. The third group, small business class. This class consists of small business owners and craftspeople who may hire a few employees, but largely do their own work. Some of these professionals now share attributes with members of the capital class. That's because they may own their own business, may have 1 or 2 employees or their own. They sell product and they make an income. It is in the small business class that we find many people's hopes of achieving upward mobility. Next is the working class. The working class is made up of a number of subgroups, to which 2 of which are blue-collar workers, and this includes the high-skilled and highly paid people, to the lower skill, low pay, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, janitors, and gardeners. Now that part has been shifting over time. White-collar workers are included. There would be more the administrative assistants, clerical workers, sales staff, and they take orders, they don't give orders. The working class consists of about half of all employees in Canada. Now, we are all probably fully aware that poverty does exist in Canada. We can look at what are some of the outcomes or consequences when living in poverty. Some of the consequences to living in poverty, well, income and wealth are intricately related to our individual life chances. People with high income and substantial wealth have more control over their lives. Persons with less income, especially those living in poverty, must spend their limited resources on the basic necessities of life: physical, mental health, and nutrition. People who are wealthy and well-educated and who have high-paying jobs are more likely to be healthy than poor people. In other words, wealth equals health. People who are poor have shorter life expectancies and are at greater risk for chronic illnesses such as diabetes, especially type 2 because it's a lifestyle issue, quality of food and the amount of exercise, heart disease, cancer, as well as for infectious diseases such as tuberculosis. Children born into poor families are at greater risk for dying during their first year of life. Most of the poor do not receive preventative medical or dental checkups. Now that's started to change with the Healthy Smiles Ontario program, where dental is free up to the age of 17. Hunger is related to class position in income inequality. Now the two images I'm going to show you behind here, I'll put one up and then the other. These were investigative reports looking at access to the rich and the poor to having access to doctors, nutritional fresh food, and healthy recreational facilities in relationship to where they live. The report notes that the rich are proximity-wise closer to healthy food, doctors, and exercise facilities than the poor are. The poor are far further away from those sources. The second image that I'm showing is a report on where the poor live and where the pollution-producing industries are located. And it's not surprising that where the pollution is produced is also where the low-income people live in Toronto. Okay, let's look at education. Educational opportunities and life chances are directly linked. Functionalist theorists, they view education as the elevator to social mobility. Conflict theorists stress that schools are agencies for reproducing the capitalist class system and perpetuating inequality in society. What about crime and the lack of safety? What consequences might there be around that? Although people from all classes commit crimes, they commit different types of crimes. Capitalism produces social inequalities that contribute to criminality among people. Poverty and violence are also linked. So let's look at poverty in Canada. Our picture of who the poor are in Canada it's not easy to answer because we don't know exactly, but it may have been in the past more easy to make that discern, but now not so much. Not only are they unemployed or those with not only are they people who are unemployed or are those on social assistance, they are more like representative people who just look like you and I. Today, the poor can also include hard-working, full-time employed. There was a recent report that was indicating that the number of part-time faculty who teach in colleges and universities, the high percentage of part-time employees who are also among the working poor. Now, before we get too far, it's important to note that there's no poverty line in Canada. The official poverty line is based on what is considered to be the minimum amount of money required for living at a subsistence level. Canada has no official definition for poverty, no official way of measuring poverty, and no official poverty line. The most accepted definition of poverty is Statistics Canada before it was called the tax low income cutoff. It's the income level at which the family may be in strained circumstances because it spends considerably more of the basic necessities of life, food, shelter, and clothing, than the average family. Now, this measure varies by family size and community size. So according to the It's the LICO measure. Any individual or family that spends more than 70% of its income on those necessities, food, clothing, and shelter, is considered to be living in poverty. Now, after calculating the cost for food, shelter, and clothing, there is only a fraction left for personal care, household needs, furniture, telephone, transportation, school, internet success, health care providing. There is no money for entertainment, recreation, reading material, insurance. When sociologists define poverty, they distinguish between absolute poverty and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is a level of economic deprivation in which people do not have the means to secure the basic necessities of life. Relative poverty is a level of economic deprivation in which people may be able to afford basic necessities, but they are still unable to maintain an average standard of living. So who are the poor? Well, poverty in Canada is not randomly distributed, but it is highly concentrated in certain groups of people. Women, children, people with disabilities, Indigenous people. So what about age? Does age play a role? Well, poverty rates for children under the age of 18 is approximately 17%. That's very high. More than 1.3 million Canadian children are living in poverty. And a large number of children hover just above the official poverty measure from Stats Canada. Gender. Well, about 2/3 of all adults living in poverty in Canada are women. Women in all categories are at greater risk of poverty than men, known as the feminization of poverty. The risk is particularly significant in single-parented families headed by women. All women are not equally susceptible to poverty. Many visible minority women may have experienced a reshuffled poverty. That's a condition of deprivation that follows them regardless of the type of family in which they live. There's another term that's called multiple jeopardies, and it refers to the even greater risk of poverty experienced by women who are immigrants, members of a visible minority, Indigenous, or have a disability. Now, it's a really eye-opener when you look at who are the poor, and you have to remember that when we go through these categories of who represents, and you might go, well, that doesn't seem right, but this is data-based. This is not based on a belief or our thinking. This is based on numbers that have been collected, counted, and categorized. So they're accurate. We may not like them. We may not want to agree with them. But they are what they are. So we come to the next one, which is race. A disproportionate percentage of the impoverished in Canada are Indigenous persons and recent immigrants. Indigenous people are among the most severely disadvantaged. About 1/3 live in poverty. The median income for Indigenous person is just over $29,000 as compared to the national average of income, $75,000. It's a big difference. We can move to disability. Many persons with disabilities continue to be excluded from the workplace, not because of the disability itself, but because of the environmental barriers in the workplace. That in spite of in Ontario having an Accessibility Act that was to make all public buildings accessible to people with disabilities occur in by the year 2000, I think it was 25. They had 25 years to do that. It was with Dalton McGuinty in Ontario and around 2000 who made that. If you walk around, how many places have done their work to get ready? Environmental barriers. Not as many as that should be. And there will be all kinds of comeuppance for that by the year 2025. Adults with disabilities have significantly lower incomes than Canadians without disabilities. The self-reported median total of income of working age persons with disabilities was slightly more than $20,000 per year. Now, we're going to touch on some of the economic and structural sources of poverty. Poverty has both economic and structural forces. The economic forces, about 1/3 of low-income families have one working parent full-time. Minimum wage full-time jobs do not allow a worker to keep a family of 4 above whatever poverty line we might select. The structural features, changing our society from an industrial-based one to an information-based one, increased automation, but it also, that automation means less jobs, closure of many factories, the deindustrialization of North America. I think it was in 2005 in Ontario, we had by that time lost close to 500,000 manufacturing jobs in the auto industry. That's 500,000 people who weren't working anymore, who need to re-educate to get work. So the deindustrialization, what's that? This is where corporations have been de-investing in Canada and millions have lost their jobs. They've put the jobs elsewhere in the world for cheaper. The emergence of what is termed the job de-skilling, it's a reduction in the proficiency needed to perform a specific job that leads to a corresponding reduction in wages for that job. A shift from manufacturing to service occupations has resulted in the loss of higher paying positions and their replacement with lower paying and less secure positions. Now lastly, we're going to explore sociological perspectives on social inequality. And as we have done, we will start with the functionalists. Social inequality is not only inevitable, but it is necessary for a smooth functioning of society. Now that's always been somewhat the functionalist perspective. The Davis-Moore thesis is that the definitive functionalist explanation for social inequality. And they state that all societies have an important task that must be accomplished. Some positions are more important than others. The most important positions must be filled by the most qualified people. 4, the positions that require talent that is scarce must be the most highly rewarded. And then 5, those most highly rewarded should be functionally unique and on which people in other positions rely for expertise, direction, or financing. Now, the Davis-Moore thesis assumed that social stratification results in mediocrity, a hierarchy in which all positions are rewarded based on people's ability and credentials. This thesis is critiqued on several levels, including that it ignores inequalities based on inherited wealth and intergenerational family status. Next, we'll move into conflict. And from a conflict perspective, people with economic and political power are able to shape and distribute the rewards, resources, and privileges and opportunities in society for their own benefit. The core values in Canada emphasize the importance of material possessions, hard work, individual initiatives to get ahead, and behavior that supports the existing social structure. So the conflict theorists also note that laws and the informal social norms support that inequality in Canada, that the culture supports that capitalist social structure. Now the feminists, well, according to the feminist scholars, the quality of the individual's life experience is a reflection of both class position and gender. They always include gender as being a dividing point in society, and that's part of what has had a huge positive impact in Canada. The social inequalities within a social class, gender is added to class to result in a double ghetto and the second shift. Some of the evidence that we can look to, many women work in low-paying positions and their income on average is less than men's. women, more than men, work the double shift, or what's also known as the second shift. Women are more likely than men to engage in family care, which is not remunerated. So when women become mothers, they often lose the accumulated wealth and experience by having to take time off to look after children. Within any class, women are less advantaged than men. The causes of the inequity lie in the organization of capitalism itself. Now we'll look at the symbolic interactionalists. Now they usually do not analyze the larger structure factors that contribute to inequality and poverty. They only look at the more micro-analysis route, not the macro. A few studies provide rare insights into the social interactions between people from vastly different class locations. A study by Domhoff that wealthy businessmen are bound together by the games and rituals and the sharing of meals and other activities that they do together. Another example of the micro perspective, the face-to-face interactions and displays. This differential behavior between non-equals confirms that inequality in the relationship. Now, deference is the kind of thing when a person that you perceive an authority, speaks to you, you defer by eyes down, head down, and sort of, respect, deference. That's what's expected. That's what's meant by differential behavior. Researchers have found that the wealthy often demand deference from a lower class person. All right, everybody. Don't want to leave you on a deference. That's not my role to you. Well, that brings us to the end of Sociology 1. I hope you've enjoyed this class and gained something from this. But we are now done. So good luck in your future, everybody. And if you're interested in taking anything in this winter, I hope you feel free to take one of my courses again in the winter. All right, everybody. Bye and enjoy your day.